It started like any other routine flight. Passengers were buckling up, flight attendants were smiling and directing people to their seats, and the faint sound of luggage wheels scraping across the overhead bins filled the air. But what was supposed to be an uneventful trip, at 30,000 feet, quickly turned into something no one on board would ever forget. In the aisle, a tall, broad-shouldered police officer stood out against the usual crowd of travelers. His uniform was neatly pressed, his demeanor calm but commanding. His presence alone had already drawn curious stares, but the sudden shift in his tone changed everything. He wasn't here to board as a passenger. He was here for something much more serious. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stand up and come with me," the officer said firmly, his voice cutting through the murmurs and chatter like a blade. All eyes turned toward the back of the plane, where a woman sat quietly, her face unreadable. She was black, elegant, and composed, dressed in a way that suggested both confidence and class. The tension in the cabin was immediate. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, some whispering while others craned their necks to get a better view. The woman looked up at the officer, her gaze steady, her expression calm. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. "You're under investigation," the officer replied curtly, avoiding any details that might explain the scene unfolding before a growingly uneasy audience. "Please come with me." The woman hesitated, her hands resting on the book she'd been reading. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, but something about her silence spoke volumes. People could feel the weight of the moment, even without knowing the full story. "Is this necessary?" A voice from a nearby row finally broke through the silence. A middle-aged man in a business suit leaned forward, clearly uncomfortable. The officer ignored him, his focus unwavering. As the woman rose slowly, the air seemed to grow heavier. People were on edge, unsure of what they were witnessing, but certain it was something significant. Her movements were deliberate, graceful, as if she refused to let the moment define her. As she stepped into the aisle, she paused, turning back slightly to glance at the faces staring at her. Then, with an unexpected calm that left everyone holding their breath, she spoke one sentence. Just one. The words were simple, yet they hit like a thunderclap. The entire cabin froze, the officer faltered for the first time, and the whispers stopped dead in their tracks. It was as if the plane itself held its breath. What did she say? What could have possibly silenced an entire plane and even shaken the composure of a seasoned law enforcement officer? What happened next would change everything. The entire cabin felt like it was holding its breath, each passenger frozen in the moment, waiting to see what would happen next. The officer's face twitched, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his otherwise controlled expression. He opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated, the woman's words clearly still echoing in his mind. Passengers closest to the scene leaned in, their curiosity now overriding their initial discomfort. Those farther back whispered urgently among themselves, speculating about what could possibly be happening. The tension grew heavier with every second. The woman stood there, poised and unshaken, her presence commanding attention despite the chaos simmering beneath the surface. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice now carrying a trace of something he hadn't shown before doubt. "This isn't the place to." But before he could finish, she held up a hand, her palm out, her gesture both calm and firm. She wasn't being defiant. She wasn't being aggressive. It was something much more deliberate, something that made everyone stop and reconsider their assumptions. "I'll go with you," she said finally, her tone even and resolute. But not without explaining why this is happening in front of all these people. Her words were a ripple in the ocean of silence. More passengers turned in their seats, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. There was something about her calm refusal to be swept away without clarity that struck a chord, something undeniable in the strength she carried. The officer shifted on his feet, glancing around as if only now realizing the full weight of the eyes on him. He wasn't just making an arrest anymore. He was performing an act in a theater of judgment, where every spectator was silently deciding whose side to believe. "This isn't the time or place," he repeated, though his voice wavered slightly. "We'll talk about it once we're off this plane." "And yet," she replied, her words deliberate, "you've chosen to make it the time and place by coming onto this plane in front of all these people. So, I think they deserve to hear what's going on too." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Passengers began pulling out their phones, some discreetly recording, others holding them outright. It wasn't long before the faint sound of camera shutters clicking joined the hum of the plane's air conditioning. "Is this really happening right now?" someone whispered loudly from the row behind her. "I've never seen anything like this," another passenger muttered, clutching the armrest of their seat. The officer's jaw tightened. He was clearly trying to maintain control of the situation, but it was slipping through his fingers with every second that passed. He glanced toward the front of the plane, where a flight attendant stood frozen, her wide eyes darting between the officer and the woman. "Please," the officer said, his voice dropping into a lower, more measured tone. "I need you to come with me now. This doesn't need to escalate." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Escalate? I'm standing here calmly, asking for the same respect you'd want in my position. Don't make it sound like I'm the one creating a scene." Her words carried weight, resonating with the onlookers who were growing bolder in their whispers and sidelong glances. A few nodded subtly, their silent agreement written across their faces. The officer sighed, a heavy, frustrated sound that revealed more than he likely intended. He pulled a notepad from his pocket and flipped it open, scanning whatever was written there. "You're being detained," he began, his voice more clipped now, "in connection with an investigation into fraudulent activity. Your name was flagged, and we've been authorized to bring you in for questioning." The woman raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Fraudulent activity? That's interesting. And what exactly am I accused of doing?" Her question hung in the air like a challenge. The officer looked down at his notepad again, his expression unreadable. "That's all I can say right now," he replied. "You mean that's all you know right now?" she said, her voice sharp but still controlled. "You've come onto a plane full of people to publicly humiliate me over something you can't even explain." The murmurs grew louder. People shifted in their seats, their discomfort now mingling with indignation. A man sitting across the aisle spoke up, his voice steady and clear. "This doesn't feel right," he said. "If she's done something wrong, why can't you say what it is? Why all the secrecy?" The officer glanced at the man, his irritation beginning to show. "This is a law enforcement matter," he snapped. "I suggest you let us do our job." The woman turned her head slightly, acknowledging the man with a nod before addressing the officer again. "No one here is stopping you from doing your job. We're just asking for transparency, something you seem reluctant to provide." Another ripple of agreement moved through the cabin. More phones were raised, their screens glowing as passengers documented every word and movement. The officer seemed to realize the tide of public opinion was shifting, and his frustration deepened. "Enough," he said, his voice rising. "This isn't a debate. You need to come with me now." The woman didn't flinch, she didn't argue. Instead, she took a step closer to him, her calm demeanor unwavering. "I will," she said, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. "But I want you to remember something. Every single person here is watching. Every single person, and so is whatever camera you're wearing." Her words landed with a finality that silenced even the whispers. The officer's hand instinctively moved to the small camera clipped to his chest, his expression shifting as he seemed to realize the implications. "Fine," he said after a moment, his tone begrudging. "We'll do this your way, for now." The woman nodded once, then turned to retrieve her bag from the overhead compartment. As she did, she glanced at the passengers around her, her gaze lingering just long enough to acknowledge their silent support. The officer gestured for her to move toward the front of the plane, and she complied, walking with the same grace and composure she'd shown throughout the entire ordeal. Passengers turned in their seats to watch her go, their eyes filled with curiosity, admiration, and a hint of unease. As she disappeared through the cabin door, the murmurs erupted into full-blown conversations. Everyone had an opinion, a theory, a question. Who was she? What had she done, or not done? And most importantly, what would happen next? The plane felt different now, as if it had been touched by something bigger than the mundane journey it was supposed to be. People stared at the closed door she'd walked through, their minds racing with unanswered questions. And somewhere in the back of the plane, a young woman pressed stop on her phone's recording, a knowing look in her eyes. She had a feeling this wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. As the plane's engines hummed quietly in the background, the conversations between passengers grew more animated. The sudden removal of the woman had left everyone unsettled, and theories were flying in every direction. Some were quick to judge, others more sympathetic, but no one could deny the oddity of the situation. In row 14, an older couple exchanged worried glances. "I don't like how that officer handled it," the woman said, her voice low but urgent. "He couldn't even explain what she was accused of. That's not right." Her husband nodded, his brow furrowed. "It felt off, didn't it? She didn't look like someone guilty of anything. She looked calm, too calm." Across the aisle, a teenager in oversized headphones whispered into her phone. "No, seriously, I'm recording the whole thing." She said something that just shut him up, and now they're gone. "Yeah, it's crazy." Meanwhile, near the front of the plane, the flight attendants huddled together, their expressions tense. One of them, a young woman named Clara, looked particularly shaken. "Do you think we should have done something?" she asked her colleague. "I mean, stepping in or saying something." Her older co-worker, a man with years of experience under his belt, shook his head. "This is above our pay grade," he muttered. "But I'll tell you this much. It's going to be a nightmare for the airline if this blows up on social media. Look at how many people were recording." Back on the ground, the woman and the officer walked briskly through the terminal. She carried her bag with a steady grip, her steps unhurried, despite the growing number of eyes following them. The officer glanced at her occasionally, his tension evident in the way his shoulders stiffened every time she met his gaze. At the security office, they entered a small, sterile room where another officer was waiting. This one looked older, more seasoned, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He stood as they entered, his expression neutral but alert. "This her?" he asked the younger officer. "Yes, sir," came the reply, though his tone lacked the confidence he'd shown earlier on the plane. The older officer gestured toward a chair. "Have a seat," he said to the woman, his tone polite but firm. She didn't hesitate, settling into the chair and placing her bag on the floor beside her. She crossed her legs and folded her hands in her lap, her calm demeanor unchanged. "Can I ask what this is about?" she said, her voice breaking the silence. The older officer pulled out a file, flipping it open and scanning its contents before looking up at her. "Your name came up in connection with a case we're investigating," he said. "We've been tracking a series of fraudulent activities involving stolen identities, and your name is tied to one of the flagged accounts." She raised an eyebrow, her expression one of mild curiosity rather than alarm. "And you believe I'm involved in this?" "We don't make these decisions lightly," the officer replied, though his voice lacked the conviction she might have expected. "We're just following the evidence." She leaned back slightly, her gaze never leaving his. "Evidence you don't seem willing to share with me," she said. "Interesting." The older officer's eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't used to people responding this way. Most either got defensive or panicked. But this woman was different. She exuded a quiet confidence that made him uneasy, as though she already knew something he didn't. "Where were you traveling to today?" he asked, changing tactics. "Home," she replied simply. "And where is home?" "Does that matter?" she countered, her tone still calm, but carrying a subtle edge. "It might," he said. "We need to establish your movements to see if they align with our investigation." She let out a soft laugh, the sound light but cutting. "You've already disrupted my travel plans and brought me here without explanation. Now you want me to help you build a case against me." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly feeling the weight of her words. The older officer, however, remained composed, though his jaw tightened ever so slightly. "This can go one of two ways," he said, leaning forward. "You can cooperate and clear this up quickly, or you can make it more complicated for yourself." Her eyes sparkled with something almost like amusement. "You seem awfully sure there's something to clear up," she said, "but let me save you some time. I don't know what you're talking about. I have no connection to fraudulent accounts, stolen identities, or whatever else you're investigating." He studied her for a long moment, searching for cracks in her composure, but found none. Back on the plane, the atmosphere remained tense. Clara, the young flight attendant, walked down the aisle, checking on passengers who looked more rattled than usual. She overheard snippets of conversations as she passed. "I heard she's some kind of executive," one man whispered. "Maybe they got the wrong person," someone else said. "Or maybe she's just really good at hiding it," a skeptical voice chimed in. Clara stopped near the teenager with the headphones, who was scrolling through her phone, a look of intense focus on her face. "Excuse me," Clara said gently. "Is everything okay here?" The teenager looked up, startled. "Oh yeah. Just following what's happening, I guess." She hesitated, then added, "It's kind of crazy, isn't it? She didn't seem like she was guilty of anything." Clara nodded slowly, her thoughts mirroring the girl's words. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, and the uncertainty was gnawing at her. In the security office, the older officer finally closed the file and leaned back in his chair. "If you're innocent," he said, "then you have nothing to worry about." She smiled faintly, the expression unreadable. "Innocent until proven guilty, isn't that how it's supposed to work?" "That's how it works," he replied. "Then why do I feel like you've already decided otherwise?" she asked, her tone soft but piercing. Her question hung in the air, the weight of it pressing down on everyone in the room. The younger officer glanced between her and his superior, his discomfort evident. The older officer said nothing, his silence speaking volumes. Back on the plane, passengers continued to buzz with speculation. Clara returned to her seat near the galley, her thoughts racing. Something told her this story was far from over. The tension in the security office grew thicker with every passing second. The older officer tapped his pen against the table, his gaze fixed on the woman as if trying to crack a puzzle that refused to reveal itself. She sat there, unbothered, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the unease in the room. The younger officer shifted again, clearing his throat nervously. "Maybe we should." "She can wait," the older officer cut in, his tone sharp, though it seemed more directed at his own frustration than at his colleague. The woman leaned forward slightly, her fingers laced together on the table. "If you're waiting for me to break or confess to something I didn't do, you'll be here a while," she said. "So why don't we cut the theatrics and get to the point?" The older officer's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, there was a knock on the door. Another officer stepped in, holding a tablet in his hand. He whispered something to the older officer, who immediately stiffened. His expression darkened as he scanned the screen, his lips pressing into a tight line. "What is it?" the younger officer asked, his voice tinged with curiosity and concern. The older officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he set the tablet down on the table, turning it so the woman could see the screen. On it was a series of documents, spreadsheets filled with transactions, and a photo, a grainy image of someone who bore a striking resemblance to her. "This is why you're here," he said, his voice cold. "We've traced these fraudulent transactions back to an account opened under your name, with this identification." The woman glanced at the screen, her face remaining impassive. "And you think that's me?" she asked calmly. "It's your name, your photo, your information," he replied, his tone laced with accusation. "Correction," she said, leaning back. "It's someone pretending to be me, and if you were thorough, you'd already know that." Her words hit like a challenge, and the younger officer looked at his superior, waiting to see how he would respond. The older officer, however, wasn't ready to back down. It's easy to deny, he said, but the evidence points directly to you. Evidence, she repeated, almost to herself, a voice steady. You call that evidence? A stolen identity and a manipulated account. Tell me something. How often do you stop to consider that the person sitting across from you might be the victim instead of the suspect? The older officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough for her to notice. You don't, do you? She continued, her voice growing sharper. You see a name, a face, and you assume guilt because it's easier than admitting the system you work for is flawed. But here's the thing, you've got the wrong person, and you're wasting time that could be spent finding the real one. Her words hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a knife. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably again, clearly conflicted. The older officer, however, wasn't ready to let go of his authority. Then prove it, he said, his tone daring. If you're innocent, show us something that clears your name. The woman's calm exterior didn't falter. She reached into her bag, moving slowly so as not to alarm them, and pulled out a folder. She slid it across the table, her gaze unwavering. Start there, she said simply. The older officer opened the folder, flipping through its contents. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the documents, copies of emails, letters from banks, even an affidavit from an investigator. Each piece painted a clear picture of someone who had been trying to fight an identity theft case for months, only to be met with bureaucracy and roadblocks. The younger officer leaned over his shoulder, his eyes widening as he took in the information. Sir, he said quietly, this changes things. The older officer didn't respond right away. He flipped through the last of the papers, his jaw tightening as the truth began to sink in. Back on the plane, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. She had spent the last hour trying to calm passengers and reassure them that everything was under control, but the knot in her stomach told her otherwise. What do you think really happened? A fellow flight attendant asked as they stood near the galley. I don't know, Clara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I don't think she deserved to be treated that way. Something about it didn't feel right. The passengers were still buzzing with speculation, and the videos being uploaded online were already beginning to circulate. By the time the flight landed, the story would be everywhere, and the pressure on the authorities to explain themselves would only grow. Back in the security office, the silence was deafening as the older officer closed the folder and set it down. His expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the shift in the room's energy. This doesn't clear you completely, he said finally, though his voice lacked its earlier edge. It's not my job to clear myself, the woman replied. It's your job to do your due diligence. Or is that too much to ask? The younger officer looked between them, his discomfort growing by the second. Sir, he said cautiously, maybe we should take another look at this case. If she's telling the truth. She's telling the truth, a voice interrupted from the doorway. Everyone turned to see a man in a sharp suit walking into the room, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He carried an air of authority that immediately shifted the dynamic in the room. And who are you? The older officer demanded, though his confidence seemed to waver. Special Agent Carter, the man replied, flashing his credentials. And I've been following this case for months. If you bothered to check with the right departments, you'd know that she's not your suspect, she's a witness. The room fell silent, the revelation landing like a thunderclap. The woman didn't react, though a faint hint of satisfaction flickered in her eyes. You've made a mistake, Agent Carter continued, his tone firm. And it's one that's going to cost you if we don't fix it immediately. The older officer's face reddened, his authority crumbling as the weight of his error became impossible to ignore. The younger officer sat back in his chair, looking both relieved and frustrated. The woman, however, remained composed. She stood slowly, gathering her bag and the folder she had brought with her. I tried to tell you, she said, her voice steady. Maybe next time you'll listen. As she turned to leave, the tension in the room reached its peak. This wasn't over, not yet. The fallout from this moment would ripple far beyond the walls of the small security office, and everyone in the room knew it. As the woman exited the room, her heels clicking against the polished floor, Agent Carter turned to the two officers. His expression was a mix of frustration and urgency. "This situation is spiraling," he said firmly. "I need you both to pull every piece of data you have on this case and send it to me immediately. This woman isn't just a witness, she's in danger." The younger officer blinked in surprise. Danger? From who? From the same people who stole her identity, Carter replied, his tone sharp. "They're not just running a scam, they're part of a larger operation. And if they think she knows too much or might lead us to them, they won't hesitate to silence her." The older officer, still reeling from the confrontation, finally spoke. "Why weren't we briefed on this sooner?" "Because you weren't supposed to be involved," Carter snapped. "Your department wasn't clear for this level of the investigation. You've made things more complicated by detaining her and exposing her location. Now we're on borrowed time." In the terminal, the woman's calm demeanor began to waver as she walked toward the exit. She glanced over her shoulder, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. Something didn't feel right. The crowd around her moved with its usual airport bustle, but she couldn't shake the sensation that she was being watched. She quickened her pace, her grip tightening on her bag. Her mind raced as she replayed the events of the day. Was it possible they were still watching her? Could they have known she would be on that flight? Just as she reached the curb to hail a taxi, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. Hesitating for only a moment, she answered. "Hello. It's Carter," came the voice on the other end. "Listen carefully. You're not safe. We've uncovered new information, and I need you to get to a secure location. I'm sending a car for you now." Her pulse quickened. "What kind of information?" "They know you're cooperating," he said, "and they're closer than we thought." Before she could respond, a black SUV pulled up in front of her. The window rolled down, revealing a man in a suit holding up a badge. "Agent Carter sent me," he said quickly. "We need to move." She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to be cautious. "How do I know you're not one of them?" The man's expression remained calm. "You don't," he admitted. "But if you stay here, you won't have time to find out." She glanced around, her unease growing. A group of men in casual clothing stood near the entrance, their eyes fixed on her. One of them spoke into his phone, his gaze never leaving her. Her decision was made in an instant. She climbed into the SUV, slamming the door behind her as the vehicle sped away. Back in the security office, Carter was on the phone, barking orders to a team of agents. "We've got a breach," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Her cover's blown, and we've got eyes on possible suspects in the terminal. I need a team on the ground now." The older officer, still in the room, ran a hand over his face. "What have we done?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The younger officer looked at him, a mix of guilt and determination in his expression. "We still have a chance to make it right," he said, "but we need to act fast." As the SUV weaved through traffic, the woman kept her eyes on the side mirrors, watching for any signs of pursuit. The driver glanced at her briefly. "You've handled yourself well so far," he said, "but things are about to get more dangerous. Do you trust Agent Carter?" She hesitated before answering. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I don't have much of a choice." The driver nodded, his grip tightening on the wheel. "That's the right answer." Suddenly, the car behind them swerved into their lane, accelerating rapidly. The woman's heart leaped as the driver cursed under his breath. "Hold on," he said, gripping the wheel tightly. The SUV veered sharply, narrowly avoiding a collision. The pursuing car matched their movements, its intent unmistakable. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice rising with panic. "Not the good guys," the driver replied grimly. "Stay down." As the chase unfolded, it became clear that this was no ordinary group of criminals. The precision of their movements, the coordination, It all pointed to a highly organized operation. Back at the airport, Carter received an update through his earpiece. The suspects have made contact, the voice on the other end said. They're pursuing her vehicle. We're dispatching backup now. Carter's jaw tightened. Tell them to hurry. We can't afford to lose her. The woman, crouched low in the back seat of the SUV, felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Everything she thought she knew about her life, her identity, was unraveling. And now, she was caught in the middle of something far bigger than herself. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Whatever happens, don't stop fighting, he said. They want to scare you, but you're stronger than they think. Her resolve hardened as his words sank in. She wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter, and she wasn't going down without a fight. The SUV swerved again, narrowly avoiding a roadblock as the pursuing car closed in. The woman braced herself, knowing that the next move could determine whether she lived to see the end of this ordeal or became just another casualty in a story she never asked to be a part of. The SUV careened around a sharp corner, tires screeching against the asphalt. The woman clutched the seat, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The pursuing car was relentless, closing the distance with alarming precision. The driver swerved again, narrowly avoiding a collision with a delivery truck. We're running out of time, he muttered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The woman glanced out the window, her mind racing. This wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. Whoever was behind this operation wasn't going to stop until they silenced her completely. She refused to let that happen. Suddenly, the SUV's radio crackled to life. This is Agent Carter, a voice said, loud and clear. You've got backup inbound. Hold your position and prepare for extraction. The driver's jaw tightened as he spoke into the receiver. We don't have time to wait. They're closing in. Do not engage, Carter ordered. We've got units cutting off their escape routes. Just hold on. The woman looked over her shoulder and saw the second car pulling alongside them. Her heart leaped into her throat as the passenger window rolled down and a man leaned out, a weapon gleaming in his hand. The driver reacted instantly, slamming on the brakes and veering to the side. The pursuing car overshot, swerving wildly as its driver fought to regain control. For a brief moment, the SUV had some distance, but the reprieve was short-lived. The woman's phone buzzed again. She fumbled to answer it, her hands trembling. What now? She asked, her voice tight. It's Carter, the voice said. There's a safe house 2 blocks ahead. Take the next left and head straight there. We've got agents waiting to intercept. The driver nodded, having overheard. You heard him. Hold on. The SUV sped down the street, the safe house coming into view, a nondescript building tucked between a row of warehouses. As they approached, 2 unmarked cars appeared, blocking the road behind them. The pursuing vehicle skidded to a stop, its occupants hesitating as agents poured out of the unmarked cars, weapons drawn. The SUV screeched to a halt in front of the safe house. The driver jumped out, opening the door for the woman. Go, he shouted. She stumbled out, her legs shaky but her resolve unbroken. 2 agents flanked her, ushering her inside, while the driver stayed behind to assist with the standoff. Inside the safe house, Agent Carter was waiting. He stood tall, his expression unreadable as he motioned for her to sit. Is it over? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Not quite, Carter replied, his tone heavy. We've apprehended some of their men, but their leader is still out there, and there's something you need to know. Her stomach dropped. What is it? Carter hesitated, his eyes locking onto hers. This wasn't random, he said finally. The person behind this, the one who stole your identity and set you up, is someone you know. The room seemed to tilt, her mind struggling to process his words. What are you talking about? He pulled a tablet from his bag and placed it on the table. A photo appeared on the screen, a man with a sharp jawline and piercing eyes. The woman's breath hitched as recognition set in. No, she whispered, shaking her head. That's not possible. It's more than possible, Carter said grimly. It's the truth. He's been using your identity to funnel money through fraudulent accounts, all while keeping you in the dark. We believe he orchestrated the entire plane incident to distract from his real operations. Tears welled in her eyes as the weight of betrayal hit her. The man in the photo wasn't just anyone. He was someone she had trusted, someone she had let into her life. As if sensing her thoughts, Carter softened his tone. I know this is hard to hear, he said, but we need your help to bring him down. You're the only one who can. Before she could respond, the safe house door burst open, and an agent rushed in. Sir, he said urgently, we've got a problem. They're regrouping. We've intercepted communications. They're planning to storm this location. Carter cursed under his breath. We need to move her now, he said. The woman stood, her legs steadier now. I'm not running, she said firmly. If he's behind this, then I want to see it through. Tell me what I need to do. Carter studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, he said, but this isn't going to be easy. The safe house erupted into a flurry of activity as agents prepared for the next phase of the operation. The woman steeled herself, knowing that the hardest part was still to come. Outside, the night air was thick with tension as the agents escorted her to an armored vehicle. As they pulled away, she caught one last glimpse of the building in the rearview mirror. A shadow moved in the distance, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger was only just beginning. The driver turned to her, his voice low. Ready? She nodded, her jaw set with determination. Let's finish this. But as they drove into the night, one question lingered in her mind. If someone so close to her could betray her so deeply, who else might be hiding secrets? And what other truths were waiting to be uncovered? The armored vehicle moved swiftly through the darkened streets, the tension inside almost palpable. The woman sat silently, her mind spinning with a mix of fear, anger, and determination. Beside her, Carter was reviewing the mission details on his tablet, his face a mask of concentration. We're heading to a secure command post, he said, breaking the silence. From there, we'll coordinate the operation. This ends tonight. She nodded, her resolve solidifying with every passing moment. There was no turning back now. The man she had trusted had orchestrated a web of lies and danger that had nearly consumed her life. She wouldn't stop until the truth came to light and justice was served. The vehicle pulled into an unmarked warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Inside, a team of agents was already assembled, their equipment glowing under the dim lights. Carter led her to a table where a detailed map of the area was laid out. This is where he's holed up, Carter explained, pointing to a location on the map. We've tracked his movements and confirmed his presence. He's surrounded by armed guards, but we've planned a strategy to minimize risk. The woman studied the map, her jaw tightening. And what about me? She asked. Carter hesitated. You'll stay here, he said finally. It's too dangerous for you to be involved in the operation. She shook her head. No, I've come this far. If I don't confront him, I'll never be able to move on. Her voice was steady, leaving no room for argument. Carter sighed, but didn't push back. All right, he said, but you'll stay with me at all times. Understood. She nodded, and the team began preparing for the raid. The operation was swift and precise. The agents surrounded the target building, their movements synchronized and efficient. Inside the vehicle, the woman's heart pounded as she watched the events unfold on a live feed. She felt a mix of dread and anticipation as the agents breached the perimeter and moved in. When Carter signaled for her to follow, she stepped out of the vehicle, her legs shaky but determined. The building was eerily quiet as they entered, the air thick with tension. As they moved through the dimly lit corridors, they found him in an office at the back of the building. The man who had once been a trusted part of her life now stood cornered, his expression unreadable as he raised his hands in surrender. Step away from the desk, Carter ordered, his weapon trained on the man. The woman stepped forward, her eyes locked on the man who had caused her so much pain. Why? she asked, her voice trembling. Why did you do this? He smirked, his demeanor unsettlingly calm. You wouldn't understand, he said. It was never personal. You were just convenient. Her fists clenched at his words, but she refused to let his coldness break her composure. Convenient? She repeated, her voice rising. You ruined my life, put me in danger, and made me question everything I thought I knew. And for what? Money, power. His smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. You wouldn't believe me if I told you, he said finally. Try me, she shot back. But before he could answer, one of the agents called out. We've got something. Carter and the woman turned to see the agent holding a laptop. The screen displayed a series of encrypted files, each labeled with names that hinted at an operation far larger than they had anticipated. This isn't just about her, the agent said, his voice grim. He's been running this scheme across multiple cities. There are dozens of victims. The man laughed, a hollow sound that echoed in the small room. And you think stopping me will change anything, he said. There's always someone else ready to take my place. Carter stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Maybe, he said, but it won't be you. As the agents took the man into custody, the woman felt a wave of emotions wash over her. Relief, anger, sadness, it was all there, crashing over her like a storm. Back at the command post, the agents began unraveling the files, piecing together the full scope of the operation. The woman sat quietly in a corner, her thoughts racing. Carter approached her, his expression softer now. You did good, he said. Because of you, we were able to stop him and help a lot of other people. She nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. What happens now? She asked. Now, we make sure this doesn't happen again, he said, and you start rebuilding your life. It wasn't a perfect ending. Nothing ever is. But as she left the command post that night, she felt a sense of closure. The man who had betrayed her was behind bars, and the truth was finally out. In the weeks that followed, she worked with the authorities to help other victims of the scheme. It wasn't easy, but it gave her a sense of purpose and a way to reclaim her narrative. One day, as she walked through the city, she caught her reflection in a shop window. For the first time in months, she saw strength staring back at her. She had faced the darkness and come out on the other side. Life would go on, and she knew there would be more challenges ahead. But now she was ready to face them, on her own terms, and that, she realized, was the greatest victory of all.